Good morning, Year 3-4, and welcome to your final whole class reading session of the week. We've been practicing lots of different reading strategies throughout the week, and today we're going to read a chapter using all four strategies we focused on this week. So I want you to follow the writing using your finger. I want you to use a ruler to know what line you're on. I want you to read out loud using expression, tone, and volume. And I want you to pay attention to punctuation. In particular, full stops and commas where we take a breath. Okay, I want you to focus on all four things when you're doing that. I want you to be reading along with me out loud. After Cliff had been striding along for an hour or two, Oliver saw a shape on the sea ahead. Then another. They looked like small stony islands, but he couldn't be certain of that anymore. He pointed the islands out to Iris. Are they more rambling isles? The mermaid peered in the direction he was pointing. I think they were once, she said, but they've settled down. What does that mean? It means just what it sounds like. Some of them lose the urge to keep wandering. They give up collecting bits and pieces for their seawigs, and once they stop moving, they sort of take root. Silt and sand pile up around their feet, and weeds grow on them, and coral, and there they stay. One of the settled islands was quite close now. Looking down through the waves, Oliver thought he could see its stony face, blurred by weed and masked with barnacles. Are they dead? He asked. Or just asleep? They're settled, said Iris. They are just islands now. I hope Cliff never settles, said Oliver. I like him rambling about. I wouldn't want him to be just an island. Oh, don't worry, said Iris, and swished her tail in the rock pool, cleaning the sand from between her scales. Once he has the water mole on top of him, he'll win for sure. It's completely brilliant. Oliver nodded, hoping she was right. Then a bad thought struck him. Iris, how can you find your way back to this submarine wreck if you can't even find your own way home? I can smell it, silly, said Iris. It's in a very smelly patch of sea. Can't you smell it yet? Oliver sniffed. Sure enough, there was a scent on the air of green things growing and rotting. Hour after hour the scent grew stronger, and that afternoon they saw a darkness that lay like a green shadow on the sea ahead. Soon it stretched from horizon to horizon. As they entered its outer fringes, Oliver realised that the whole face of the ocean was clogged with drifting weed. We must be in the Sargasso Sea, he said excitedly. Sailors fear it because their ships just get becalmed here, and the weed tangles round them and traps them. No, this is a completely different place, said Iris. It's called the Sarcastic Sea, and sailors fear it because the weed keeps making horrid, hurtful comments about them. Sure enough, as Cliff carried them deeper into the weed, they began to hear its little mocking voices calling out to them. Ooh, a mermaid! That's just what we need! And, nice seawig, mate! And, I love the inflatable dinghy. Orange is such a distasteful colour. And you can tell that it didn't mean any of the things it said. In fact, it meant exactly the opposite, and all its comments were followed by scornful sniggers, or whispery conversations that ended in laughter. The weed of the Sarcastic Sea was very sarcastic weed indeed. As Cliff ploughed onwards, great clumps of the stuff began piling up on the beach, and Oliver noticed that, as well as the little bladders that helped keep ordinary types of seaweed afloat, its strands were dotted with beady eyes, which all looked witheringly at him. He took out his notebook and made a sketch, knowing that his mum and dad would be interested when he found them. "Ooh, nice notebook," said a bit of weed which he was drawing. "Wish I could draw like that," said another bit. "Not." But the weeds did not much like being snagged on Cliff's beaches, because once they were out of the waves, Mr. Culpepper stalked around, pecking at the tiny crabs and water bugs which lived amongst them. "Oi!" they squeaked. "Watch it with the beak!" "Ow!" Oliver felt sorry for the weed, and he and Iris began making their way around Cliff's shores, shoveling it back into the waves and getting precious little thanks. The floating weed soon learned to keep out of the way of the oncoming island. It drew back to make a path for Cliff, and by the time Iris told him to stop, there was a broad patch of water all around him. "This is the place," the mermaid said. "Are you sure?" asked Oliver. This bit of sarcastic sea looked just the same as the rest to him. "Two currents meet here," replied Iris primly. "The sea smells different. The mortar mole is right beneath us. Come and see for yourself if you don't believe me." So Oliver fetched his swimming things and goggles, took a deep breath and plunged after Iris into the waves, where a few small, left behind strands of seaweed still floated, sneering. "Those swimmers really suit you, I don't think." With a flicker of her tail, Iris went racing down into the green shallows. She was a clumsy thing on dry land, but in the water she was lithe and nimble. Oliver struggled after her, down past Cliff's huge watchful face, till far below he started to make out the summits of drowned mountains rising dimly from ocean deeps. By the time he saw them, the breath that Oliver had taken before he died has almost run out. His eyes bulged and his heart hammered. Bubbles seeped from the corners of his mouth and swam towards the surface like silver jellyfish. Then, in the last instants before he had to follow them, he glimpsed the wreck. The water mole lay on the rocky top of one of those mountains. Weed and coral had transformed its hull into a strange underwater cathedral. Fish darted in and out of the shattered windows at the stern, and an eel as stripy as a gypsy's stocking had tied itself like a bow around the figurehead. Iris bumped into the cabin, groped her way up the ladder, and perched on the top, beaming up at Oliver as if to say, "I told you so." But Oliver could stay no longer in her underwater world. He kicked his legs and shot back to the surface in a rush of bubbles, bursting out into the sunshine and taking deep gulps of fresh, delicious air. Cliff rose out of the sea beside him, with falls of white water cascading off his brow. "It's there," said Oliver, treading water in front of the island's nose. "It's lovely. It will make an awesome wig." But how were they going to lift it? Raising wrecks was difficult. Oliver knew that. He'd seen Cliff's clumsy, stony hands. He was afraid they'd crush the water mole to splinters if Cliff simply tried to pick it up. "You must go down to it," he said. "Go under the sea?" said Cliff, eyes widening. "But what about my sands? My shells? My bits of rope? They'll all wash off if I go under. And more to the point, what about my nest?" demanded Mr. Culpepper, circling above Oliver's head. "I know," said Oliver. He scrambled back onto Cliff's beach and quickly gathered anything that looked as if it might float away, including the albatross nest. He dumped it all onto the dinghy and then climbed in with it. Then, while Iris swam about below directing things, she wasn't much help because her eyesight was even worse underwater than it was above, but she liked to feel important. Cliff knelt down on his gigantic underwater knees and let the waves of the sarcastic sea swirl over his head. Oliver put on his goggles again and hung over the edge of his dinghy with his face in the sea as the waters lifted it. Down in the green gloom far below he saw Cliff carefully edge his way towards the wreck, and glimpsed the flash of Iris's rainbow tail as she circled, gesturing at Cliff to move left a bit, right a bit, stop, come forward. She didn't realise that she had her back to Cliff. She was actually gesturing at a confused-looking whale, which just happened to be passing. Cliff went right up to the wreck. He nudged it with his head and tugged at it with his stumpy, stony arms. At last it shifted and rolled gently sideways. Oliver jumped up. "That's it!" he hooted, although Oliver knew the rambling isle couldn't hear him. "You've done it! Now come up!" Cliff settled the weight of the ancient submarine on his head and began to rise. Carefully, with swirls of sand glittering in the sea around him. He came up under the dinghy in a great roaring and rushing and bubbling of water, and floppering and floundering of stranded fishes. Most of them were washed back into the sea as Cliff continued to rise, and the waters poured off him. Soon there was a beach beneath Oliver's dinghy again. On the top of Cliff's head lay the warsmole, all wet and startling and shiny in the sunlight. The striped eel had slithered off, and the gilded bowsprit glimmering faintly, pointing at the sky. It was the finest wig an island ever wore. "Yay!" shouted Oliver, jumping out of the dinghy and doing a victory dance among the rock pools. "Yay!" said Iris, flopping ashore and wringing out her head. "Yay!" rumbled Cliff, and "Yay!" called Mr. Culpepper. Only the sarcastic strands of floating weed were unimpressed. Showy, they complained, still keeping a safe distance from Cliff's shores. Shipwrecks are so last season. But they were only seaweed, so who cared what they thought? Then Mr. Culpepper, gliding down to the perch on the coral-encrusted flagstaff, said suddenly, "What's that?" Oliver turned to look. There behind him in the weedy sea, an island stood. He could not believe that he hadn't noticed it before. And we're going to stop there. I hope you're doing all 4 of those fluency things, and well done for reading with me. And this week we've read 4 chapters. So next week we're going to continue from chapter 5. Well done, and see you next week for your whole class read.